So now that you have a better understanding of how the databases actually operate, I want to get into some of the more powerful advanced search options you can use when you're using them. In this video, we're going to go over what we librarians call Boolean operators. Overly technical name aside, Boolean operators are an incredibly powerful set of tools that you can use to help organize your thoughts, conduct very powerful and detailed searches, and save you time. Especially if you're working with large, complicated set of search terms. Essentially, Boolean operators are three simple little words you can put in your search strings that tell the database to behave in a certain way. The three operators are AND, OR, and NOT. Note the all caps spelling of them. The first one I'm going to go over is AND, as it's the easiest one to explain and the one you've actually already been using, even if you didn't know you were. Alright, so talking about the AND Boolean operator here, it's actually like ridiculously easy to use. As I mentioned in the previous slide, you're probably already doing that. So I'm just going to kind of give you an example of how it works, just as kind of a baseline point of understanding of how these things work, and it'll also give me an opportunity to explain how all of these little extra search boxes work. So I have a search here for racial identity, microaggression, and effect. Just trying to get at the effects of microaggressions on racial identity, or racial identity is a moderating role in that. And if I run that search in PsycInfo, I get 27 results. Now, if I go to another PsycInfo window, I've got all the same search terms as the last search. Just a racial identity, microaggression, effect, racial identity, microaggression, and effect. But it's organized differently. I'm using these extra boxes and things like that. The reason for that is twofold. It's again to show you how AND actually works, and to then kind of point out that these extra search boxes can be very handy. Now, some of you out there may be thinking that I'm going to get a different set of results. And if I run that search, you'll see that I won't actually get a different set of results. I'll get 27, 27, completely matched up. And that's just simply because AND is the default behavior of these databases. And you'll probably hear me say that a lot in this presentation. So when I'm actually running this search, what the database is doing is it is putting, an uppercase AND in between all those terms. Rerun that search again, nothing has changed. Because this is just what the database automatically does behind the scenes when you type in search terms. And so when you're in this situation over here and you're breaking these search terms apart, you aren't actually changing the instructions you're giving to the database. You're just reorganizing them so that maybe they're just a little easier to keep a track of in your own mind. So think of these extra search boxes as just a way to organize your thoughts. So as you can see, I broke up our search string essentially by the three concepts that were being represented by the search string. So racial identity right here is a search term, or a set of search terms, and it's an idea in its own box. Then microaggression in its own box, and then effect in its own box. And so essentially, we haven't changed the search string at all. This and this are the exact same set of instructions to the database. We're just changing how we're organizing it in our own mind. So as you can see, the AND operator is pretty easy to use. Because it's so straightforward, and because it's that basic additive command, it's the default way that almost any online search tool is going to operate. You can see here on a Venn diagram an example of how this works conceptually. It's important to note that there will almost never be a situation where you actually need to type in the AND operator when you're conducting your searches. Back in the old days, in the dark ages of the internet, it was much more common to actually have to do that. But now it's understood that that's the default behavior a database is going to use, and the advance of technology and user interface design have gotten us to the point where you can just assume that it's going to be there and you don't have to type it in. Or, on the other hand, is much more situationally useful and is something you will definitely have to actually specify the use of, by typing it out. You're not going to use it all the time, but it can be very powerful when you actually need it. Looking at another Venn diagram here, you can see conceptually how OR behaves when you're actually using it in a database. Essentially, OR gives you the ability to run two or more searches at the same time in one go, rather than running them all individually. Now, this can be very useful for some of those things I mentioned in the last video, synonyms and acronyms in particular, but you do have to be careful when you're using it. Now, compared to AND, OR is a much more situationally useful tool, but it's a very, very powerful tool. It's probably the most useful of the three for certain situations, and it's really good to understand how it works. So in this example, I've run a search for racial identity, racism, and depression, and I've gotten 77 results. And in another search, another example, I've run a search for racial identity, microaggression, and depression. I've only gotten 13 results. So I've run these two searches separately. That's two separate, enactments of my labor. But what I can do is I can actually combine those two searches in this way. I can do racial identity, racism, or microaggression in this box, and then run depression, and then I get 80 results. Now I realize that racism and microaggression aren't like total synonyms, but they are related terms, and you may be looking at both of them at the same time. And so this is a situation where OR is very useful because it took two individual searches and ran them as one. Now importantly, you'll notice that I've only got 80 results here, but I've got 13 here and 77 here, so that's 90 results. So what this is also doing is then deduplicating duplicate results. So you're only, instead of having to sort through those two lists and note that there's going to be 10 ones that are cross over between the two, the database is going to take care of that for you. It's a really powerful way to deal with related terms and especially synonyms and things like that, because it saves you time and it saves you work. However, you do have to be really careful with where you are actually using OR in your search string creation. Generally speaking, I say that you always have to use it inside a box like I have here, and please note the all uppercase spelling of it, because you're separating out those two terms as separate ideas. Because if you're not careful with it, like so if I have this search here, racial identity, depression, and racism, or microaggression, like on the surface it looks like it's a pretty, it looks like it's going to do what this search did. But if we actually run that search, we're going to find a different reality here. We're going to get 649 results as opposed to the maybe expected 80. And the reason for that is because what we've actually told the database here is that we've told it to look for articles that contain racial identity and depression and racism or microaggression. It's not racism or microaggression, it's all three of these or microaggression. So it's those 77 results from our first search, this guy right here, plus another 500 some odd from a search that's just looking for the word microaggression. So be careful when you're using OR. The last operator I'm going to talk about is NOT. Now NOT is even more of a situational tool than OR, and even more potentially harmful to your search efforts if used incorrectly. Additionally, it's not an additive tool like OR and AND, it's a subtractive thing. As you might expect, here is a conceptual diagram of how NOT actually operates. Importantly, NOT is a way to exclude concepts from your search results, as it tells the database to exclude results with the search terms you've identified. This is an ability that can be very useful in sifting through the literature of closely related topics. Again, though, you do have to be careful when using NOT. Alright, so NOT is even more situationally useful than OR. There are very few times I think you'll really have to use it. Usually just good keyword selection is going to avoid situations where you're dealing with bodies of literature that are so closely related they're really hard to pull out. But it's not to say that it's useless. So in the example I'm going to show you guys here, I've done a search for dementia treatment in Latino. We got 61 articles. Now, as you know, dementia is certainly a symptom of Alzheimer's, and most people kind of conflate those two things. So if you're not interested in Alzheimer's being a thing, you're interested in other forms of dementia, we can do a situation where we do not Alzheimer's, and then we only get 32 results. And so we are hopefully conceptually excluding Alzheimer's as a part of the research we're seeing. Now, it's really kind of hard to show an example of using NOT incorrectly, just because it's a pretty detailed body of literature we're in anyways with psychology, and so it's really hard to get into situations sometimes where you have you're seeing a lot of results for a branch of the research you're not interested in. But I do have to caution you to be careful when you're using NOT, because you are not, again, excluding a concept. You are just excluding a specific word. So the database is just, in this case, looking at Alzheimer's as a variable. And so the articles it's going to show you will not contain that word. So just please keep that in mind, that when you are saying, to exclude a word using the NOT operator, you're just excluding that word, not as an idea. And so even if that word is just mentioned casually or very in a minor situation in an article, it'll still catch it as something that won't be shown. So yeah, be careful. The one last thing I would like to mention is that it is not unimaginable that you could go through an entire research project without consciously using these operators. And that's fine. And or not are just extra tools in your toolboxes. While not technically a Boolean operator, I do want to talk about one last technique you can use while searching, specifically the use of quotation marks to set groups of search terms as phrases. As you learned in the last video, the databases don't look at your search terms as much more than variables that need to be present in order for an article to appear on a results list. The order, frequency, and position relative to the other terms aren't really factors. However, you can force the databases to search for a phrase rather than the individual search terms by placing quotation marks around a group of search terms. To close out the video here, I'm going to do an example of how quotation marks can be really useful. So here we've run a search for post-traumatic stress disorder, just the 4 individual words. Again, the database, as I'm going to constantly remind you, is just looking for articles that contain those 4 words. And so we've gotten a little over 24,000 results. Now, if I put quotation marks around those words to turn it into a phrase, it takes those 4 individual search terms and turns it into essentially one. So instead of looking for just those 4 words in any order, any location, any frequency, it's looking for the words in that order, together and grouped together. And so we go from 24,000 to almost 9,000. That's a pretty huge jump. Obviously, you want your search string to be more detailed than this, but it can be a really powerful way to group words together for common phrases. So you're not just accidentally looking for these things individually. So you're actually narrowed down on a term of art. However, you do really have to be careful with quotation marks, because what you put quotation marks around, you have to in some way ensure is an actual phrase. Like, you don't want to put quotation marks around something that won't appear in the literature. Because if I do something like this, where I accidentally put post-traumatic stress disorder military in quotation marks, I don't actually get any results, because that's not a real phrase. Now, this is kind of an extreme example, because I don't think anybody here expected that to be an actual phrase in use in the literature. But it is a very good example of. But you have to be very clear with your terminology and things like that, and think about your background research.